The letter had crossed an ocean and half a continent before it reached Caroline Heller's hands in Hamburg. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that promised permanence. The words were carefully penned in English she had labored to understand. Come west, Caroline. I have built us a house beside a river where the water runs clear and the sky stretches forever. Your intended husband, Jeremiah Heller. She had read it so many times, the folds had worn thin as spider silk, the ink fading where her fingers traced his name. In the lamp-lit evenings of her father's workshop before the fever took him, before hunger drove her to the marriage agent's office, she had imagined that house, that river, that man who wanted to build a future with her. Now in the suffocating darkness of a wooden crate rattling on a freight wagon, Caroline understood with brutal clarity that the letter had been bait. The house, a fiction. Jeremiah Heller, if he had ever existed, a name plucked from a list of dead men whose identities could be stolen without consequence. Niccolo Romano, the so-called marriage agent with his oil-slick smile and promises of respectable husbands waiting in Montana territory, had stripped her of everything when his men dragged her into the crate. Her small trunk of belongings, the silver locket her mother had given her, even the letter. All that remained was the torn hem of her dress, where she had hidden the pages she had torn from Romano's ledger in a desperate moment when he'd left his office to argue with the man whose right hand was a gleaming hook. She had seen the ledger lying open, had seen the columns of names, women's names beside purchase prices and destination codes, had seen the crude map showing a line cut away from something labeled White River, with survey stakes marked in red ink and the initials CM scrawled in the margin. Cornelius Maddox. Even in Hamburg, even across the Atlantic, that name carried weight. Cattle baron, empire builder. A man who took what he wanted and crushed anyone who stood between him and profit. Caroline had ripped the pages free, her hands shaking, and stuffed them into her hem along with a brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand that had fallen to the floor. Evidence she didn't fully understand, but knew was important. The telegraph clerk also handled freight forwarding, keeping the brass stencil by the counter for marking crates. Then Romano's men had returned, and the world had narrowed to rope burns and splinters, and the terrified breathing of 3 other women pressed against her in the dark. Isolde, barely 19, who had left Bavaria dreaming of teaching music to ranchers' children. Frida, 32, a widow who'd believed the promise of a shopkeeper husband in silver lining. And Juliana, quiet and watchful, who never said where she came from or why she'd trusted the agent's promises. Now they were cargo being shipped to Bent Creek. To buyers who wouldn't ask questions, to a fate that made Caroline's stomach turn and her jaw clench with a fury that surprised her. She had been raised to be soft, to be obedient, to lower her eyes when men spoke. But somewhere between Hamburg and this God's-forsaken crate, she had become something else, something harder, something that refused to disappear quietly. The wagon jolted to a stop. Through gaps in the slats, Caroline glimpsed a dusty street, weathered buildings, the kind of frontier town that looked like it had been thrown together in a week and might blow away in a strong wind. Coyote Springs, she guessed, the last stop before Bent Creek. A ranch hand's voice drifted through the wood. Keep 'em quiet till we move out tonight. The hammer strikes that followed were methodical, final, nails driven deep. Caroline's fingers found the hem of her dress. The packet was still there. She closed her eyes and breathed, forcing down panic, and made herself a promise if she was going to vanish, someone would know why. Someone would have proof. The crate tilted as rough hands dragged it off the wagon. She braced against Isolde, who whimpered softly. "Hold on," Caroline whispered in German. "Just hold on." Then impossibly she heard it. The scrape of metal on metal, a knife working at the hasp. Light flooded in blinding after hours of darkness, and a silhouette filled the opening. A man. Lakota, she thought, though her knowledge of the tribes came only from the frightened whispers of other immigrants on the westward journey. He was lean and weathered, perhaps in his early 30s, with a scar that bisected his left brow and pulled his eye into a permanent squint. His buckskin jacket was stained with travel, and his moccasins made no sound as he shifted his weight. But it was his eyes that held her dark and steady, carrying the kind of stillness that came from hunting, from being hunted, from surviving, when survival seemed impossible. He pressed a finger to his lips, listened. Footsteps and rough laughter drifted from somewhere outside the shed. Caroline made a decision born of desperation and something deeper in instinct that whispered this man, whoever he was not her enemy. She pulled the oilcloth packet from her hem and held it out. Their fingers brushed as he took it. His were scarred and calloused, marked by rope and reins and a lifetime of hard use. Hers were cold, trembling with exhaustion and fear. The contact lasted a heartbeat, maybe two, but something passed between them, a current of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement. She saw his eyes widen fractionally as he registered the deliberateness of her action and the trust implicit in handing him evidence she'd risked everything to steal. He unwrapped the packet, his movements economical and sure. His eyes scanned the torn ledger pages. She watched his jaw tighten as he read the names, the prices, the codes. Then he examined the map, and his expression shifted into something colder, harder, ancient rage held in check by iron discipline. When he saw the brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand with Maddox's brand stamped into the metal, his scarred hand clenched briefly before he forced it open. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked at her then, and she met his gaze without flinching. Let him see that she understood what she'd stolen. Let him see that she would fight. He gave a single sharp nod, respect she realized from someone who understood the cost of defiance. Then he cut their ropes with a knife that whispered through hemp like a breath. When I open that door, he said, his voice low and textured like stones rolling in a river current. You run north. Follow the cottonwoods. 2 miles. There's a cabin doors half off its hinges, roof sags on the east side. Wait there. I'll come. Who are you? Caroline's English was careful, each word shaped by months of study in Hamburg's cramped boarding house. Enepe. He glanced toward the door, listening. Then, with a brevity that somehow conveyed more than a speech, he added, You were brave to take this. He tapped the packet. Stay brave a little longer. Go. Now. He pushed the shed door wide. Late afternoon light poured in, harsh and unforgiving, turning the dust motes into spinning gold. Caroline grabbed Isolde's arm and pulled her up. Run, she hissed. All of you, don't look back. They stumbled into the open air, their legs weak from confinement, vision swimming. Caroline's torn dress caught on a nail, and she yanked it free, hearing fabric rip. Behind them, Enepe stood in the doorway, his body a wall between them and whatever came next, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. His stance was that of a man who had held impossible lines before. Caroline glanced back once as they fled. He was still standing there, watching them go with those dark, steady eyes, and she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not gratitude, not yet. But perhaps the beginning of hope. Perhaps the recognition that she was no longer alone in this fight. They ran until the cottonwoods swallowed them, and the town disappeared behind a veil of sage and buffalo grass. And Caroline, gasping and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, kept running because she had survived this long, and she would not stop now. Enepe had been tracking Cornelius Maddox's operations for 3 years, piecing together a pattern of theft and violence that stretched across 4 counties. Water rights filed under false names. Survey markers moved in the dead of night. Farmers who protested finding their wells poisoned or their livestock dead. And behind it all, Maddox, a man who had built an empire on stolen water and broken treaties, who believed the law was whatever he could buy. But human trafficking. That was new? Or perhaps Enepe had simply never dug deep enough to see it. He'd been in Coyote Springs for 5 days watching the freight depot, following the wagons that came and went with suspicious regularity. He'd seen Hook Hand Harry Maddox's foreman, a cruel man, who wore his prosthetic like a badge of honor, and his violence like a second skin. He'd seen Sheriff Quincy Barrett take an envelope from Harry outside the Silver Spur Saloon, and the transaction quick and practiced. And he'd seen the crates. Always the crates nailed shut, loaded after dark, heading north toward Bent Creek. Yesterday, he'd followed one of Maddox's riders to a camp in the hills and watched from a distance as the man met with someone Enepe recognized. Someone whose presence hit him like a fist to the gut. Chaska, his cousin, his brother in all but blood. The boy he'd hunted with, fought beside, trusted with his life. Chaska had been wearing a deputy's badge, one of the cheap tin stars Maddox handed out to men who did his dirty work. He'd looked older, harder, his face weathered by winters that had been harsh for the tribe since the treaties. They'd spoken briefly, Chaska and the rider, and then Chaska had ridden back toward Coyote Springs while the rider headed north. Enepe had wanted to call out, to demand answers, to ask how Chaska could wear that badge after what Maddox had done. But he'd stayed hidden, watching his cousin disappear into the gathering dusk, and felt the old wound of betrayal tear open fresh. Because Chaska had been there 8 years ago, had been one of Maddox's men when they came to burn the Lakota camp over a water dispute. Enepe's father had tried to stand against them, had argued that the treaties protected their rights to the spring. They'd shot him where he stood. Then they'd torched everything. Winona Enepe's sister, 16 years old, with a laugh, like water over stones, and dreams of becoming a teacher, had been trapped in their lodge when the flames rose. Enepe had tried to reach her, had burned his hands tearing at the hide walls, but the fire had been too fast, too hungry. He'd heard her screaming, and then he'd heard nothing at all. In the years since he'd relived those final moments, countless times, and the smell of burning leather and flesh, the heat that had seared his lungs, the terrible silence that followed her last cry. Some nights he still woke, gasping, his hands clutching at phantom flames. And Chaska had stood with Maddox's men and watched it burn. Enepe had spent 8 years trying to understand, trying to reconcile the boy who'd been his brother with the man who'd chosen survival over family. The treaties had broken the tribes, scattered them, left them hungry and desperate. Perhaps Chaska had simply done what he needed to survive. Perhaps there was no malice in it, only the terrible calculus of a hard winter and empty bellies. But when Enepe had seen him yesterday wearing that badge, he'd felt only cold fury. And now, cutting 4 women free from a crate destined for Bent Creek, he understood that Maddox's crimes ran deeper than theft. They ran to the bone. He waited in the shed until the women were out of sight, his dog Maddo, a scarred, brindled mutt, with one torn ear pressed against his leg. The animal whined softly, sensing danger. Enepe reached down and scratched behind the good ear. "Easy," he murmured. "Not yet." Voices approached. Enepe slipped out the back of the shed and melted into the maze of alleys that made up Coyote Springs' less respectable quarter. No one saw him. He'd learned long ago how to move through a place without leaving ripples, how to be smoke and shadow when he needed to be. By the time Hook Hand Harry discovered the empty crate, Enepe was a mile outside town, following the cottonwood line north toward the cabin, where 4 frightened women waited for him to make good on his promise. The line cabin had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging under the weight of too many hard winters, its door hanging crooked on leather hinges that should have been replaced long ago. But the walls were solid, the stone chimney still drew, and it was far enough from town that casual riders wouldn't stumble across it. Enepe found the women huddled inside, pressed against the far wall like cornered animals. The blonde Caroline stood in front of the others, a broken fence slat gripped in both hands like a club. When she saw him, she didn't lower it immediately. Her knuckles were white on the wood, her stance defensive but determined. "You came?" she said. Not relief, not gratitude. Just statement of fact, as if she'd made herself believe it despite the odds. "I said I would." Enepe moved to the cold hearth and began building a fire, his hands working through the familiar motions. Kindling, tinder, the strike of flint on steel. Sparks caught, and he fed the infant flame until it grew strong enough to push back the shadows. Only then did Caroline lower the slat. Her hands shook slightly as she set it down the first crack in her armor. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Enepe sat back on his heels and looked at them, 4 women who'd been sold like livestock, who'd crossed an ocean chasing promises that turned out to be lies. "You're not safe. Not until we get that evidence to someone who can use it." "What evidence?" The one called Frida spoke for the first time, her English thick with a German accent, but clear. She was older than the others, with a scar running from her temple to her jaw and eyes that had seen hard things. Caroline pulled the oilcloth packet from where Enepe had set it by the hearth. She unwrapped it carefully, laying out the torn ledger pages, the crude map, the brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand. "These. I took them from Romano's office." Isolde leaned forward, her eyes wide. "You stole from him." "He stole from us first," Caroline said flatly. "Our money, our futures, our choices. I took proof." Juliana, who had not spoken at all until now, reached out and touched the map with one finger. "This line, it cuts away from the river." "Why, water theft," Enepe said. "Maddox is diverting White River into his own reservoir. Farmers downstream are losing their wells. Crops are dying." "And the names in the ledger?" Frida asked, her voice tight. "Women, like you. Shipped west by Romano and sold to buyers who don't ask questions. The money funds Maddox's water operation." Silence fell heavy and terrible. Then Caroline spoke, her voice hard as flint. "We stopped them." Enepe looked at her, saw the steel beneath the exhaustion, the fury beneath the fear. "How?" "You said we need to get this to someone who can use it." "Who?" "There's a federal marshal circuit that runs through Mercury Falls. If we can get word to them, then we get word to them." Caroline interrupted. She looked at the other women. "All of us. Together." Isolde's voice trembled. "They will come looking for us." "Let them," Frida said. Her hand moved to her throat where a bruise was darkening. "I am tired of running. I ran from poverty in Bavaria. I ran from my husband's debts. I will not run from this." There was something final in her tone, a line drawn. Juliana nodded, silent but resolute. Even in her quietness, there was a quality of endurance, the kind that came from surviving things she would never speak of. Enepe studied them, these 4 women, who had every reason to hide, to flee, to disappear into the vast anonymity of the frontier. Instead, they were choosing to fight. It reminded him of Winona, who had believed that teaching was how you changed the world one child at a time, who had refused to be silent even when silence meant safety. "All right," he said. "Then we fight. But we do it smart." Enepe left them at the cabin and rode back toward Coyote Springs under cover of darkness, Maddo loping beside his horse. He needed help, someone with resources, someone the law couldn't simply ignore. Someone like kind Kate. Kate had been a schoolteacher for 20 years, educating the children of miners and farmers and the occasional rancher's son who wanted more than a life chasing cattle. She'd lost her husband to cholera, her only son to the war back east, and her faith in easy answers long ago. but she'd never lost her backbone. Inepe found her in the small house behind the schoolhouse, a single lamp burning in the window. He whistled low and sharp a bird call that wasn't quite right and waited. A moment later, the door opened, and Kate stood there, a small percussion revolver in her hand. Inepe. She lowered the gun when she recognized him. What trouble are you bringing me this time? The kind that needs a midwife and a woman who isn't afraid of Maddox. Kate's eyes narrowed. Come in. Inside, he told her everything. The crate, the women, the ledger pages and map, the connection between Romano and Maddox. She listened without interrupting, her weathered face impassive. When he finished, she stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out bottles of carbolic acid, clean rags, and a tin of salve. Rope burns and dehydration, I'd wager, she said. Bring them here tomorrow before dawn. They can hide in the schoolhouse cellar while we figure out the next move. The sheriff, Quincy Barrett, is a coward who'll fold the moment someone bigger shows up. Kate's voice was hard. But we need to be smart about this. If we go to Barrett with that evidence, it'll disappear. We need to go over his head. The telegraph office, Inepe said. Send word to the federal marshal in Mercury Falls. Pavel runs that office. He's in Romano's pocket, reroutes messages so they never reach their destinations. Then we convince him to send one that does. Kate smiled, sharp and cold. I like the way you think, but we'll need a distraction. Something to keep Barrett and Maddox's men busy while you get to Pavel. I have an idea, Inepe said, but I'll need Dr. Augustine's help. Henry owes me a favor. Kate began packing supplies into a canvas sack. I'll collect. Inepe returned to the cabin as the first gray light touched the eastern horizon. The women were awake, huddled close to the dying fire. Caroline looked up when he entered, and he saw exhaustion in every line of her face. But also something else. Determination. There's a woman in town, Kate, he said. She's a teacher, a midwife. She'll hide you while we get word to the federal marshal. Can we trust her? Isolde asked, her voice small. With your lives, Inepe said simply. She's already risking hers to help you. They traveled as the town was waking, keeping to the shadows and empty spaces. Kate met them at the back door of the schoolhouse and ushered them inside without a word. She lit a lamp and examined each woman in turn, cleaning rope burns, checking for breaks or deep bruises, muttering under her breath about men who thought they could own the world. When she finished, she turned to Inepe. Tell me your plan. He laid it out. Dr. Henry Augustine would report an outbreak of blood-poisoning septicemia at the stockyards. The quarantine would force Sheriff Barrett to respond publicly, keeping him occupied, while Inepe and Caroline went to the telegraph office. Pavel would send the wire by choice or by force, and the federal marshal would come. And if Pavel refuses, Kate asked. Then we make him understand what's at stake, Caroline said. She held up the brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand. This ties him to Romano, to trafficking. If he doesn't help us, he hangs with the rest. Kate studied Caroline for a long moment, then nodded. You've got steel in you, girl. Good. You'll need it. She looked at Inepe. When? Today. Before Maddox realizes the women are missing and locks the town down. Then you'd better move fast. Kate gestured toward the cellar door. The rest of you down there. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. If they find you before that wire goes out, this whole thing falls apart. Isolde's hand found Caroline's. Be careful. Caroline squeezed once. I will. Dr. Henry Augustine had been a battlefield surgeon during the war. He'd cut bullets out of boys barely old enough to shave, had amputated limbs by lamplight, while artillery shook the earth had learned to function on coffee and rage when sleep was impossible and death was everywhere. The war had ended, but the memories hadn't. They lived in the tremor of his hands when he drank too much whiskey, in the limp that plagued his right leg, where a Minier ball had shattered his hip at Antietam, in the nightmares that woke him, gasping in the small hours of the morning. When Kate knocked on his door just after dawn, he opened it with a revolver in hand and exhaustion written across his face. Then he saw her expression and holstered the gun. "Kate, what's wrong?" "I need your help. The kind that might get you shot." Henry's mouth quirked. Wouldn't be the first time. She told him the plan. His frown deepened with each sentence, but when she finished, he simply nodded. "Give me 10 minutes to gather supplies." 30 minutes later, Henry stormed into the center of town like an avenging prophet, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of carbolic acid in the other. He began shouting about contamination, about infection spreading from the stockyards, about blood-poisoning septicemia that could kill a strong man in 3 days and children in less. Townsfolk emerged from shops and houses, alarmed. Sheriff Quincy Barrett appeared, his face red with irritation, and something else, nervousness perhaps, or guilt. "What in blazes are you yelling about, Augustin?" "Blood-poisoning septicemia." Henry's voice carried across the square. "I've seen the symptoms in 3 animals at the stockyards. If it spreads to the human population..." "There's no fever," Barrett snapped. "You're seeing ghosts." "Ghosts?" Henry's voice rose to a roar. "I watched blood-poisoning septicemia turn a field hospital into a charnel house at Fredericksburg, Sheriff. I know what I'm talking about. Unless you want to explain to the territorial governor why Coyote Springs became a plague town, you'll help me establish a quarantine right now." The crowd murmured, fear rippling through them. Barrett cursed and turned to his deputy. "Fine, help him set it up. But this better not be some fool's errand, Augustine, or I'll..." "You'll what?" Henry interrupted, his eyes cold. "Arrest a doctor for trying to protect your town. Good luck explaining that." While Barrett and Henry argued, drawing more spectators, Enipe and Caroline slipped across the street toward the telegraph office. The telegraph office was narrow and cramped, wedged between a general store and a barber shop that hadn't opened yet. Inside, Pavel sat hunched over his key, tapping out a message with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done the same thing 10,000 times. He was thin, perhaps 35, with ink-stained fingers, and the haunted look of someone who'd compromised too many times and lost count of how many. When the door opened, he looked up and froze. Enipe crossed the room in 2 strides and clamped a hand over Pavel's wrist before the man could reach the drawer beneath the counter. "Don't." Pavel's breath came in shallow gasps. What do you want?" Caroline stepped forward and placed the brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand on the counter. She pressed it firmly against the message board, and it fit perfectly into a worn groove in the wood evidence of countless uses. Then she laid the torn ledger page beside it, her finger tracing the initials HHQBNR. "Hook hand Harry, Sheriff Quincy Barrett, Niccolo Romano." Her voice was controlled cold as river ice. "And you?" "Pavel, the telegraph operator who makes women disappear." Pavel's face crumpled. I didn't touch anyone. You have to believe me." "But you helped," Caroline said softly. "You rerouted their messages. Their families back east, their friends, the people searching for them. You made sure they'd never be found." "How many, Pavel? How many women?" "I didn't have a choice." Pavel's voice cracked. "Maddox, he bought my sister's farm note after her husband died. If I don't do what he says, she loses everything. Her land, her home, her children's future. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to do what's right," Enipe said quietly. But you made your choice. Now you make another one. Send a wire to Mercury Falls and Silver Lining. Tell them Coyote Springs has evidence of trafficking and water theft. Tell them we need a federal marshal. Pavel looked at Caroline, at the rope burns on her wrists, the bruise on her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes. Something shifted in his expression, shame maybe, or the last vestige of conscience struggling to the surface. If I do this, he said hoarsely, Maddox will kill my sister. If you don't. Caroline said, her voice steady. How many more sisters will disappear? How many more women will die in crates or brothels or unmarked graves because you were too afraid to do the right thing? The question hung in the air like smoke. Pavel closed his eyes, his whole body trembling. Then he turned to the telegraph key and began to tap. The wires sang each click, sending the truth racing down the line. Coyote Springs. Evidence of human trafficking and water theft. Cornelius Maddox implicated. Need federal marshal urgent. Boots thundered on the boardwalk outside. The door slammed open, and Sheriff Quincy Barrett filled the frame, his revolver already drawn. His eyes swept the room and landed on the ledger page. Step away from that key, Pavel. Pavel's fingers kept moving, tapping out the last of the message. Barrett's face darkened. He raised his gun and fired. The shot tore through Pavel's shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. He collapsed, blood blooming across his shirt like a terrible flower. Caroline screamed and dropped to her knees beside him. Enepe moved on pure instinct. He drew his own revolver and fired once. The bullet struck Barrett's gun and sent it flying from his hand with a spray of sparks. The sheriff staggered, clutching his bleeding fingers, and howled. The telegraph office door burst open again. Dr. Henry Augustine shoved through the gathering crowd, still shouting about quarantine and infection, his voice rising above the chaos. He grabbed Barrett by the collar. Sheriff, we have a crisis at the stockyards. I need you there now. Barrett tried to pull away, but the crowd pressed close, frightened and demanding answers. Henry dragged him bodily into the street, barking orders about sealing buildings and limiting movement. The confusion bought Enepe precious seconds. He knelt beside Pavel. Caroline had already torn a strip from her dress. The hem was nearly gone now, leaving her ankles bare, and was pressing it against the wound. Their hands met over the blood, working together to slow the bleeding. In that moment, with Pavel's life seeping between their fingers, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just the seamless coordination of two people who understood that survival required absolute trust. Enepe adjusted the pressure, and Caroline's hands followed his lead without question, and their movements synchronized as if they'd done this 100 times before. Pavel's eyes fluttered. Did it send? He whispered. It sent, Caroline said, her voice breaking. You did it, Pavel. You did the right thing. His mouth moved, perhaps trying to smile, perhaps trying to speak. Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp. He's alive, Enepe said, checking for a pulse. But he won't be for long if we don't get him to Henry. Outside, the town churned with noise and confusion. News was spreading trafficking, water theft. Maddox's name whispered with equal parts fear and fury. By nightfall, riders would come. The marshal would take days to arrive. They had to survive until then. They carried Pavel back to the schoolhouse, taking the long way around, avoiding the square, where Henry was still orchestrating his elaborate quarantine theater. Kate met them at the back door, took one look at the blood, and went into efficient motion. She had Pavel on her exam table within minutes, carbolic acid and needle and thread already laid out. Get out of my way, she said, not unkindly. I need room to work. Enepe and Caroline retreated to the main schoolroom. The other women emerged from the cellar, drawn by the commotion. Isolde gasped when she saw the blood on Caroline's hands and dress. Frida simply moved to help, finding clean water and rags without being asked. Juliana stood by the window, watching the street with the wariness of a hunted animal. "What happened?" Isolde asked. "The wire went out," Caroline said. She was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving only exhaustion. "But Barrett shot Pavel, and now they know. They know we're here." Enepe moved to the window beside Juliana. Through the glass, he could see townsfolk milling about, confusion giving way to angry whispers. Some looked toward the schoolhouse. Some looked toward the saloon where Maddox's men usually gathered. And there, stepping out of the alley beside the livery stable, was Chaska. Enepe's breath caught. His cousin stood in the dusty street, the deputy's badge catching the light, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Chaska's gaze swept the square and found the schoolhouse window. Found Enepe. For a long, frozen moment, they stared at each other across the distance. Enepe saw recognition flash in Chaska's eyes, followed by something more complex, regret perhaps, or the weight of choices that could never be unmade. Then Chaska's mouth moved, shaping words Enepe couldn't hear, but could read from years of shared hunts and shared language. "You should have stayed hidden, brother." Enepe's hand clenched on the window frame, hard enough that the wood groaned. Beside him, Caroline spoke softly. "Who is that?" "My cousin." The words tasted like ashes. "He works for Maddox now." "Will he come for us?" "Yes." Enepe turned from the window, his jaw set. But beneath the determination, Caroline glimpsed something else. A flicker of pain, quickly suppressed, the kind that came from wounds that never quite healed. "We need to leave. Now." Kate emerged from the back room, wiping blood from her hands. "Pavel will live if infection doesn't set in, but he can't be moved." "Then he stays," Enepe said. "The rest of us go." "Where?" Frida asked. Enepe thought fast. The federal marshal would come, but not for days. They needed somewhere defensible, somewhere Maddox's men couldn't easily surround them, somewhere with resources, water cover, escape routes. "Mustang Springs," he said. "There's an old way station there, half a day's ride north. It's been abandoned for years, but the well still works and the walls are stone. We can hold it until the marshal arrives." "And if Maddox's men find us first?" Isolde's voice was small, frightened. "Then we fight," Caroline said. She looked at Enepe, her eyes clear and hard. "We've come this far. We don't stop now." Kate began packing supplies, food, water, medical equipment, ammunition. Henry appeared, his quarantine performance concluded, and helped load saddlebags. "Take my horse," he said to Enepe. "She's steady, and she doesn't spook at gunfire." "What about you?" "I'll stay with Pavel, and I'll keep up the quarantine story as long as I can. Buy you time." Enepe gripped Henry's shoulder. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just stay alive." They left Coyote Springs as the sun reached its zenith, riding north along the Cottonwood line, Matto ranging ahead to scout the trail. Enepe led with Caroline behind him, then Isolde, Frida, and Juliana, with Kate bringing up the rear on her sway-backed mare. They moved quickly but carefully, watching for dust clouds that might signal pursuit. An hour out, Matto stopped and growled low in his throat. Enepe raised his hand, halting the group. He dismounted and moved forward on foot, using the sage for cover. Riders, 3 of them coming from the west. He recognized Hook Hand Harry by the gleam of his prosthetic, even at this distance. The others were hired guns, the kind who'd do anything for money and asked no questions. They were heading for the way station. Enepe ghosted back to the group. "They know where we're going." "How?" Isolde asked, her voice edged with panic. Someone talked, or guessed. Enepe looked at the women, exhausted, frightened, but still mounted and ready. We can circle back, try to lose them, or we can get there first and prepare. We fight, Caroline said immediately. The others nodded. Then we ride hard. Enepe swung back into the saddle. And we pray we're faster than they are. They rode. The way station at Mustang Springs had been built by the freight company a decade earlier, before the railroad made such stops less necessary. It was a squat stone building with a peaked roof, narrow windows, and a heavy door that could be barred from inside. The well stood in the center of the yard, its stone lip cracked, but still functional. A low wall meant to corral horses provided some cover. A separate storage shed stood 20 yards away, its roof partially collapsed. They reached it with perhaps an hour to spare. Enepe dismounted and began barking orders. Kate checked the well. Make sure the water's good. Isolde Frida gather anything that can be used for cover. Stack it by the windows. Juliana? I know horses, Juliana said quietly. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken since the crate. I'll secure them behind the building and check for other exits. Enepe nodded. Caroline, you're with me. We need to fortify the door. They worked quickly, efficiently. The door had rotted at the hinges, but the bar mechanism still functioned. Enepe found old planks in a lean-to and nailed them across the frame, reinforcing it. Caroline handed him nails, her movement steady, despite the exhaustion he could see in every line of her body. As they worked, their hands brushed repeatedly, passing tools, steadying boards. Each contact lingered a fraction longer than necessary. When Caroline reached up to hold a plank in place, while Enepe hammered their arms, pressed together from shoulder to wrist. Neither pulled away. The physical closeness born of necessity carried an undercurrent of something unspoken. You should rest, he said, driving in another nail. So should you. She met his eyes. But we won't, will we? No. She almost smiled. Then stop telling me what to do. He found himself smiling back just a little. Fair enough. When the last nail was driven home, Enepe tested the door's strength. Solid. Caroline stepped back, and as she did, she stumbled slightly over a loose board. Enepe's hand shot out, catching her elbow to steady her. For a moment they stood close, his grip firm on her arm, her hand instinctively bracing against his chest. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Careful, he said quietly. I am. But she didn't step back immediately. Are you? The question carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Enepe released her arm slowly, his fingers trailing down to her wrist before letting go entirely, a conscious gesture, protective and intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with the door they'd just fortified. I'm trying, he said. Outside, Matto barked, once a sharp warning. Enepe moved to the window. Dust rose on the western horizon, riders coming fast. They're here, he said. The women gathered, checking weapons with the grim efficiency of people who understood that survival was no longer guaranteed. Caroline loaded the Colt Army revolver. Enepe had taught her to use her movements, more confident now. Isolde clutched the shotgun Henry had given her, her knuckles white, but her jaw set. Frida positioned herself at the north window, her scarred face impassive. Juliana returned from securing the horses and took position at the back, a rifle in her hands. You know how to use that? Enepe asked. My husband taught me, Juliana said softly, before they killed him for his land. It was the first time she'd spoken of her past, and the words carried the weight of old grief held close. Kate checked her percussion revolver one last time. Well then, let's make them regret coming after us. Hook-hand Harry and his men rode into the yard at full gallop, their horses lathered and blowing. Harry reined up hard, his hook catching the light, and surveyed the station with cold calculation. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had seen too many brawls and enjoyed them all. "Come on out," he bellowed. "Make this easy and maybe you live." Inside, Enepe checked his Spencer rifle. 7 shots. He'd need everyone. Beside him, Caroline held the Colt, her hands steady now, the fear burned away by necessity. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm ready." Kate had positioned herself at the north window with her percussion revolver. Isolde crouched behind a pile of old crates, the shotgun resting on the edge. Frida and Juliana held the back, watching for flanking maneuvers. Harry tried again. "Last chance, send out the women, and maybe we let the rest of you walk." Enepe leaned close to the window. "Go to blazes, Harry." Harry's smile was a slash of white in his weathered face. "Your funeral." The first shots came fast, and hard bullets punching through the station's thin walls, chewing splinters from the door frame. Enepe returned fire, his shots measured and precise. One of Harry's men screamed and toppled from his horse, clutching his leg. Matto darted forward, snarling, and Harry's mount reared, nearly throwing him. Caroline fired the Colt, bucking in her hands. The bullet went wide, but it forced another rider to take cover behind the well. She took a breath, adjusted her aim the way Enepe had taught her, low, let the recoil carry, and fired again. This time the rider cursed and clutched his shoulder. "Good," Enepe said. "Just like that. Don't waste shots." The gunfight stretched into brutal minutes. Isolde fired the shotgun, once the recoil nearly knocking her down. But the spread caught a rider crossing the yard, and he went down hard, not dead, but out of the fight. Kate's shots were economical, surgical. She'd clearly handled a gun before, and her hands didn't shake. But they were outnumbered, and ammunition was finite. One of Harry's men managed to get close to the storage shed and set it alight with a torch. Flames licked at the old wood, catching fast. Smoke began drifting across the yard, stinging eyes and obscuring vision. "They're trying to smoke us out," Kate said grimly. Then 2 more riders appeared from the east, reinforcements Harry must have called. One carried a bundle of pitch-soaked rags. He lit them and hurled the flaming mass toward the station's door. It struck the wood and clung there, flames spreading hungrily across the reinforced planks. "The door's catching!" Caroline shouted. Enepe made a split-second decision. "Kate, keep them pinned. Caroline with me." They grabbed the water bucket Kate had filled from the well and ran for the door. Enepe yanked it open just enough to thrust the bucket through, dousing the flames. Bullets whined past his head, splintering the door frame. Caroline stood behind him, her body pressed against his back, one hand on his shoulder to brace him, the other holding her revolver ready to cover him. The fire sputtered, but didn't die completely. Enepe threw the empty bucket aside and grabbed another. As he leaned out again, a bullet tore through the sleeve of his jacket, close enough to feel the heat. Caroline's hand tightened on his shoulder, not pulling him back, but steadying him, her presence a silent promise. "I'm here. You're not alone." He emptied the second bucket, and the flames died. But the door was charred, weakened. One good hit from Harry's men, and it would give way. "We can't hold them like this," Frida called from the north window. "They're spreading out. They'll surround us." Enepe pulled back inside and barred the door. His mind raced, calculating angles and ammunition and time. They had perhaps 20 minutes before Harry's men breached the station, unless movement caught his eye. Through the window, he saw Juliana slip out the back of the building, moving low and fast toward the horses. "What's she doing?" Isolde gasped. Creating chaos, Kate said with grim approval. Juliana reached the horses and cut them loose with quick slashes of her knife. Then she fired her rifle into the air twice. The horses bolted, stampeding directly through Harry's position. The riders scattered, cursing their own mounts, spooked by the sudden chaos. In the confusion, Juliana sprinted back toward the station. A bullet kicked up dirt at her heels. Another tore through her skirt. She dove through the back door, and Frida slammed it shut behind her. That was foolish, Frida said, but her eyes were bright with respect. It worked, Juliana said, breathing hard. They're disorganized now. It had bought them time, but not much. Harry was already rallying his men, his voice carrying across the yard in a stream of profane orders. And then, through the dust and smoke, another figure appeared. Chaska. He rode in from the east on his roan horse, his rifle resting across his saddle, his deputy's badge catching the afternoon light. He stopped at the edge of the yard, surveying the scene with those dark, unreadable eyes. Harry saw him and shouted, "About time you showed up. Get in here and help us finish this." Chaska didn't move. He sat his horse and looked at the way station, at the narrow windows, where desperate people were making their last stand, at the bullet-scarred walls, at the smoke rising from the shed. His gaze found the window where Enepai stood, and something passed between them across the distance. A lifetime of shared memories, a choice that could never be unmade. "Chaska." Harry's voice turned ugly. "I gave you an order." "I know." Chaska's voice was quiet, but it carried the tone of a man who had made a decision and would not be moved. He turned his horse to face Harry. "I'm done taking your orders." He raised his rifle in one smooth motion and fired. The bullet took Harry in the chest, punching through meat and bone. The big man's eyes went wide with shock and betrayal. He toppled from his saddle, his hoof scraping against the hard-packed earth, and the sound ugly and final. His body twitched once, then lay still. The remaining riders stared stunned into paralysis. Chaska worked his rifle's action, chambering another round with deliberate slowness. Anyone else want to die for Maddox's money? They broke. The hired guns spurred their horses and fled, dust rising in their wake like a curse lifted. Silence crashed down over the yard, like a physical weight broken only by the crackle of flames in the storage shed and Matto's low growl. Chaska sat his horse for a long moment, his rifle still raised. Then he looked at the station window at Enepai, standing there, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet. But perhaps the beginning of understanding. Perhaps the first step on a long road toward something resembling peace. "We're not even, cousin." Chaska called his voice, carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "But maybe we're closer than we were." He reached up and unpinned the deputy's badge from his chest. For a moment he held it, the tin star catching the light. Then he dropped it in the dust beside Harry's body. The gesture was final, irrevocable. He turned his horse and rode south back toward Coyote Springs, his silhouette growing smaller against the horizon until he disappeared entirely, leaving only questions and the ghost of what brotherhood had once meant. Enepai stood at the window, his hands braced on the frame, his breath coming hard. Caroline moved to his side. She didn't speak, didn't touch him, just stood close enough that he could feel her presence steady, solid, real. After a long moment, she said quietly, "Are you all right?" "I don't know." His voice was raw. "He saved us, but he stopped, unable to finish." "He made a choice," Caroline said. "Maybe not the one you wanted, but a choice. Is it enough? I don't know, but it's something." She paused, then added softly, "And maybe that's where healing starts, with something." Enepai looked at her, then really looked at her. This woman who had been cargo in a crate only days ago, who had every reason to crumble but instead had become steel, who had stood at his back while flames licked at the door and bullets flew, who offered understanding without demanding answers. His hand found hers. Their fingers interlaced, the contact deliberate and grounding. "Thank you," he said, "for standing with me. Where else would I be?" Her grip tightened. "We're in this together now." They stood like that, hands clasped, as the others emerged cautiously from the station to survey the damage and begin putting out the fire in the shed. And for the first time since he'd opened that crate and found 4 frightened women staring up at him, Enipe felt something shift inside, a loosening of the old rage, a tentative opening towards something that might one day become peace. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later, with a posse of 6 deputies and warrants for Cornelius Maddox, Niccolo Romano Sheriff, Quincy Barrett, and a dozen others whose names appeared in the ledger. Marshal Samuel Cross was a man in his early 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of crime the frontier had to offer. He carried himself with the weary authority of someone who had learned that justice was not a given, but something that had to be fought for inch by bloody inch. He set up headquarters at the way station and began taking statements. Pavel, transported from Coyote Springs and weak but alive, testified about the rerouted messages and the trafficking operation, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Caroline, Isolde, Frida, and Juliana each gave their accounts, their voices growing stronger, with each word refusing to be silenced or dismissed. Kate and Henry corroborated the water theft, producing surveys and witness statements from farmers whose wells had gone dry. The brass shipping stencil bearing Maddox's brand and ledger pages became Exhibit A in a case that would eventually reach the Territorial Supreme Court. But Maddox himself had fled. His ranch stood empty, his men scattered. Marshal Cross organized a manhunt, and Enipe volunteered to track. They found Maddox at his reservoir camp in the hills, surrounded by the last of his loyal men. The siege lasted a night and a day. 2 of Maddox's hands tried to slip away under cover of darkness and were captured. By dawn of the 2nd day, their water was gone, and the irony of the man who stole water dying of thirst was not lost on anyone, and Maddox surrendered. He was a big man in his late 50s with iron-gray hair and a face like granite. He'd built an empire on stolen water and broken lives, and now it was crumbling. As they bound his wrists and led him to a horse, he looked at Enipe and smiled, cold and reptilian. "You think this changes anything? Men like me always come back." Enipe met his gaze without flinching. He thought of Winona's face in the firelight of 4 women in a crate of all the lives Maddox had broken and discarded. "Not this time," he said. "This time you stay buried." The trial was held in Silver Lining 6 weeks later. The courthouse was packed. Farmers who'd lost their land, families searching for missing daughters, townsfolk who'd lived in fear of Maddox for too long. Judge Thaddeus Mercer, a stern man in his 60s, with a reputation for fairness and a complete intolerance for corruption, presided. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, piece by piece: the ledger, the map, the telegraph stencil, the testimony of survivors. Maddox's lawyer, an expensive man from Denver with a silk vest and carefully practiced expressions of outrage, tried to discredit the witnesses, calling them opportunists and liars, suggesting that the women had come west willingly and were now fabricating stories for profit. But Marshal Cross was relentless, producing letter after letter from families whose daughters had vanished, financial records showing payments from Maddox to Romano, and a surveyor who admitted under oath to falsifying documents at gunpoint. When Caroline took the stand and calmly recounted her journey from Hamburg to the crate, the courtroom fell silent. When she described the moment she stole the ledger pages, knowing it might be her only chance to leave proof of her existence, several jurors looked away, visibly shaken. The trial lasted 5 days. On the final afternoon, Judge Mercer delivered the verdict in a voice that brooked no argument. "Cornelius Maddox, you are found guilty of human trafficking, conspiracy theft, of federal water rights, and accessory to murder. You are sentenced to 20 years at hard labor in the territorial prison. Your assets are forfeit and will be distributed as restitution to your victims." Maddox's face went white. He stood to protest, his lawyer already objecting. But the judge's gavel came down like thunder. "This court is adjourned. Remove the prisoner." As Maddox was led away in chains, he looked back at the gallery one last time. His eyes found Enepe, and for just a moment the mask slipped. No bravado, no threats. Just a man who had finally, irrevocably lost. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Farmers embraced each other. Women wept with relief. Caroline stood on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind tugging at her skirt, and allowed herself a small, weary smile. Enepe approached Maddo, trotting at his heels. "How do you feel?" "Like I can finally breathe," she said softly. Then she looked at him, her eyes searching. "What happens now?" "Now," he considered. "Now we rebuild. The marshal's opening a way station at Mustang Springs, officially, with federal backing. Someone needs to run it." "Are you offering me a job?" There was the hint of a smile in her voice. "I'm suggesting you might be good at it. And you, the survey team needs a scout to make sure no one else tries what Maddox did." He paused, then added quietly, "And I'd like to stay close, if that's all right with you." Caroline's smile grew soft and genuine. "I think I'd like that too." 2 weeks after the trial, a package arrived for Enepe at the way station. No return address, just his name in a hand he'd known since childhood. Inside was a knife. Bone handle yellowed with age, with a name carved into it, with painstaking care, Winona. His sister's knife. The one she'd carried everywhere, used for everything from cutting rope to carving her dreams into tree bark. He'd thought it was lost in the fire, melted or buried under ash and ruin. Beneath the knife was a letter. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smudged, as if the writer's hands had been unsteady. Enepe. "I pulled this from the ashes after the fire. The handle was charred, but the blade was intact. I kept it because I couldn't let it burn completely. I told myself it was to remember her, to honor what was lost. The truth is, I kept it because I was ashamed." Maddox ordered the fire. "I knew it was coming," he told us the day before. "He threatened my family, my mother, my sisters, the children. He said if I warned you, they would burn too. He said he would make sure of it. So I stayed silent. I stood there and watched your father fall. I stood there and listened to Winona scream. I have carried that every day since. Some nights I still hear her voice in my dreams. I'm not asking forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I don't expect it. But you should know the truth. I couldn't save her then. Maybe I was a coward. Maybe there was nothing I could have done that wouldn't have cost other lives. I don't know anymore. But at the way station, when I saw you and those women making your stand, I saw Winona in them. Her courage, her refusal to be silent. And I thought, maybe this is my chance. Maybe I can save someone else's sister. Maybe that's enough to carry forward. The knife belongs to you. It always did. Do with it what you will." Chaska Enepe read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking each reading, peeling back another layer of the pain and rage he'd carried for 8 years. The words didn't excuse what Chaska had done, but they explained. And in the explaining, they offered something Enepe hadn't expected: context. The possibility that survival sometimes required impossible choices, that cowardice and love could look the same in the moment of crisis. Caroline found him sitting on the steps of the half-built way station, the knife in his lap, tears tracking silently down his weathered face. She sat beside him without a word, respecting the privacy of his grief. After a time, he handed her the letter. She read it, her expression softening with each line. "He was afraid," she said finally, her voice gentle. "Not for himself, for his family." "Fear doesn't excuse," Ennepe's voice broke. He stopped, gathered himself. "It doesn't excuse letting an innocent girl burn." "No," Caroline agreed quietly. "It doesn't excuse. But maybe it explains. And maybe that's enough to let you start healing. Not forgiving, but healing." Ennepe looked at the knife, at his sister's name, carved with such care into the yellowed bone. He remembered Winona's hands, small and quick, always busy, always creating something. She'd wanted to teach children to read, to write, to see the world as bigger than the narrow confines of their circumstances. She'd believed that knowledge was the path to freedom. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he said, his voice raw. "Then don't. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Caroline's hand found his warm and steady. "But maybe you can let yourself stop carrying all the weight alone. You don't have to." He turned his hand, threading his fingers through hers, a deliberate gesture no longer born of necessity, but of choice. They sat together as the sun set over the newly restored white river, painting the sky in shades of amber, and rose two survivors, learning slowly how to build something from the wreckage. "She would have liked you," Ennepe said after a long silence. "Winona, she would have liked your courage, your refusal to stay silent. I wish I could have met her." "So do I." He squeezed Caroline's hand. "But maybe she'd be glad that I met you instead. That something good came from all this darkness." Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and comfort that felt entirely natural. "Something good," she echoed softly. "Yes, I think so too." The way station at Mustang Springs opened on a cold morning in late autumn. It was a modest operation, and the old stone building repaired and expanded a new barn, a bunkhouse for travelers, and a main hall where people could rest and resupply. Marshal Cross had appointed Caroline as manager, with federal salary and protection. Isolde worked the kitchen, her German cooking drawing travelers from miles around. Frida kept the accounts with ruthless precision, ensuring every cent was tracked and the operation ran honestly. Juliana tended the horses and mended tack, her quiet competence earning trust and repeat business. And Caroline stood behind the desk, greeting each arrival with steady eyes and a firm handshake that communicated both welcome and unmistakable strength. Above the door, Kate had hung a hand-carved sign, "No guns inside. No crates for people. Water is free. Speak plain." Ennepe took the job with the survey team riding circuit to ensure water rights were honored and no future Maddoxes could steal what belonged to the people. He stopped at the way station often, sometimes on business, sometimes simply because he wanted to see Caroline. One evening, 6 months after the station opened, he arrived to find her outside watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with purple and gold, the air carrying the first hint of winter's bite. He dismounted and joined her, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "I have something for you," he said finally. From his jacket, he pulled a strip of braided rawhide dyed red and decorated with a small carved symbol, a Lakota protection sign his mother had made years ago, before the treaties, before everything fell apart. "My mother gave this to Winona," he said quietly. "I found it in the ruins after the fire. I've carried it ever since, couldn't bring myself to let it go. But I think she'd want you to have it now." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "Ennepe, I can't. This belonged to your sister. Please." His voice was rough with emotion. "Winona wanted to teach to help people build better futures, to give them knowledge and hope. You're doing that. You're giving people a safe place when they have nowhere else to go. You're creating something honest and good in a world that tried to break you. She would have loved that. She would have loved you. Caroline took the rawhide with trembling hands and tied it around her wrist with careful reverence. The red braid stood out against her skin, the protection symbol catching the last light of day. When she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll honor this, and her memory. I know you will." They stood close shoulders, almost touching, and Enipe felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the old grief, a tentative opening towards something new. Something that felt like hope, like possibility, like the future might hold more than just survival. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life hunting Maddox," he said. "Thought revenge was all I had left. That justice was the only thing worth living for. And now I think maybe there's more." He turned to face her fully, his hand still holding hers. "Maybe there's building and protecting what we've built. And..." He paused, searching for words adequate to the feeling. "And people worth building it with. People who understand what it cost to get here." Caroline's free hand rose to rest against his chest, over his heart. "I came west chasing a dream that turned out to be a lie. I thought I'd lost everything, my father, my home, my future. I thought the world had taken everything from me and left me with nothing but fear. And now I think maybe I found something better, something real." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Someone real. Someone who sees me as I am, not as someone's property or commodity. Someone who stands beside me, not in front of me." Enipe's other hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "Caroline, He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've reminded me that there's more to life than the past. That survival isn't enough, we have to live." "Then let's live," she said softly. "Together, however that looks." They stood like that as stars emerged one by one, and the night wrapped around them like a promise. No grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. Just two people who had survived the darkness, choosing slowly, carefully, deliberately, to walk toward the light together. To build something worth protecting. To create a future neither had thought possible when they'd first met in the shadows of that shed in Coyote Springs. A year later, the town of Coyote Springs gathered to dedicate the new schoolhouse. It was larger than Kate's old building, with whitewashed walls, a proper bell tower, and rows of desks carved by a German carpenter named Carolyn Heller, using tools that had belonged to a man named Jeremiah. Tools she had claimed and learned to master, transforming grief into creation. Kate stood at the front, her eyes suspiciously bright, and rang the bell. Children poured inside, their laughter echoing off the walls. Above the door, carved into a wooden plaque with letters burned deep into the wood, was a dedication. In memory of Winona, who believed teaching could change the world, and Jeremiah Heller, who dreamed of building futures. Enipe stood at the back of the room, his hand resting on the plaque, his fingers tracing Winona's name. Caroline joined him, and without speaking, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was Jeremiah's carpenter's square, the wood smooth and polished from years of use. His initials still visible, burned into the handle with a careful hand. And tucked beside it was a folded piece of paper plans for a house drawn in precise detail, with notes in the margins about morning light and strong roofs and a workshop for building furniture. At the bottom, in the same careful script, for Caroline, who deserves a home as strong as she is. Marshal Cross found this in Romano's confiscated property. Enepe said quietly. Jeremiah drew these before he died. They were supposed to be sent to you along with the letter, but Romano kept them. Thought they might be useful leverage if you ever arrived and started asking questions. The marshal thought you should have them now. Caroline traced the plans with shaking fingers, her vision blurring with tears. He was real, she whispered. He really did exist. He really wanted to build something with me. He did. Enepe's voice was gentle. And these plans, they're yours. But I was thinking. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If you still want to build it, this house he dreamed of, I'd like to help. If you'll have me. Not because I'm trying to take his place, but because I want to be part of your future. Whatever that looks like. She set the plans down carefully on one of the new desks and turned to face him fully. You already are part of it, Enepe. You have been since the moment you opened that crate. Since the moment you chose to fight for us instead of walking away. Then let's build it together, he said. Your dream and his plans and our future. All of it. She took both his hands in hers in front of the gathered townspeople and children in the schoolhouse, dedicated to lost dreams and new beginnings. She smiled through her tears. Yes. Let's build it together. They built Jeremiah's house over the course of the following year, working side by side through spring mud and summer heat and the first bite of autumn cold. It stood beside White River, just as the plans had specified, with large windows that caught the morning light, and a workshop where Caroline could practice the carpentry she was learning, and a kitchen that smelled of Isolde's bread when the wind was right. They worked in comfortable silence, mostly their hands, learning the rhythm of shared labor, their movements synchronized from months of building together. Sometimes Caroline would hum German songs her father had taught her, and Enepe would add Lakota words that somehow harmonized. Sometimes they would sit on the unfinished porch as the sun set and simply exist together, talking about small things and large things and everything in between. On the night they finished the house, the last shingle nailed the last window, fitted the last board, sanded smooth, Caroline tied Winona's protection charm to the doorframe with careful reverence. Beside it, Enepe hung Jeremiah's carpenter's square, the tools that had built this place, finding a permanent home in the threshold. Then, with a carving tool heated in the fire, he burned both their initials into the threshold beam, C-H and E. The letters were simple, unadorned, but permanent. Is this all right? He asked, suddenly uncertain. I should have asked first. Caroline knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the letters. It's perfect, she said. This house was Jeremiah's dream, but we built it. Together. It should bear both our marks. They stood in the doorway of the finished house, looking out at the land they were learning to call home. The house was modest but solid, built to withstand winter storms and summer heat, built to last, built with care and intention, and the kind of love that came from surviving darkness together. They never married, not in the traditional sense, with a preacher and formal vows. The frontier didn't always hold with formalities, and they'd both learned that promises were made in actions, not words. But in every way that mattered, they were bound. By choice, by respect, by the deep trust that came from having stood back to back against impossible odds. Inside the house, they created a life. Caroline ran the way station with Isolde, Frida, and Juliana, the four women forming a family born not of blood, but of shared survival. Enepe continued his work with the survey team, ensuring that water flowed where it should, that no new Maddoxes rose to steal what wasn't theirs. In the evenings when work was done, They would sit together in the workshop, Caroline learning to carve Enape, teaching her the old patterns his mother had taught him. Sometimes Kate would visit, bringing news from town and sharp commentary on the world's foolishness. Sometimes Pavel would stop by his shoulder, healed, but carrying a visible scar his sister safely settled on land the territorial government had granted her as restitution. On quiet nights, when the house was still and the river murmured its endless song, Caroline and Enape would sit on the porch they'd built together. His arm would rest across her shoulders. Her head would lean against his chest, and they would watch the stars emerge one by one above the land that had tried to break them and failed. "Do you ever regret it?" Caroline asked one such night. Stopping that day, opening the crate. Everything that came after Enape considered the question seriously as he considered everything. "No," he said finally. "It cost us both, but it also gave us this. A future neither of us thought we'd have. People who matter. Work that means something. A home." He paused. "You. Me," she echoed softly, a smile in her voice. "And you have me. For as long as you want. Forever then," he said simply. "If that's all right." Forever sounds just right. They had survived the crate, the fire, the flood of violence and greed. They had stood together when standing seemed impossible. They had fought for justice and won though the cost had been high, and the scars would never fully fade. But now, in a house built from old dreams and new hopes beside a river that ran clear and free, they were learning what came after survival. They were learning tenderness, learning to trust not just in crisis, but in calm, learning that love earned through fire and fear and fighting side by side was the kind that lasted, the kind that could weather anything the world threw at them. The way station at Mustang Springs thrived, becoming a beacon for travelers who needed not just supplies, but the assurance that honest dealing still existed. The community grew around it, people drawn by the promise of fair treatment and the protection of federal law, people who wanted to build something better than what they'd left behind. And at the center of it all were two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful from the ruins. Two people who understood that survival was only the beginning, that the real work, the real triumph was in building a life worth living. On the porch of their house, beside the white river, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold and the air carried the promise of winter's first snow, Caroline and Enape sat together in the gathering dusk. His hand held hers. Her head rested on his shoulder, and in the comfortable silence that had become their native language, they watched the day fade and the night arrive, two survivors who had learned finally how to live. Not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of a future they had fought for, bled for, and built together board by board, choice by choice, day by day. A future earned, a future theirs.